There is one thing you were never told about the Choctaw people, not because no one knew, because people chose to stay silent about it. Open almost any old-school textbook. Find the chapter on the southeastern part of what is now the United States. The Choctaw will get a few lines. You'll be told it was a tribe, that they were relocated, maybe something about the Trail of Tears, and that's it. A people who lived on their land longer than any European cathedral has stood, were squeezed into a single paragraph between two white men's wars. Now imagine that paragraph isn't brevity, it's erasure. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that over the past few months, I haven't been reading textbooks. I've been reading the land, mounds, bones, and what modern scientists have learned to extract from bones, ancient DNA. And the picture that emerges from these three sources doesn't match the textbook paragraph in almost any way. Let's start with a simple question. Where did the Choctaw come from? If you ask the Choctaw themselves, they won't flip through books. They'll point to a mound. It stands in eastern Mississippi, and it's called Nanih Waiya. The name means something like Leaning Hill or Mother Mound. For the Choctaw, this isn't just a beautiful place. It is literally their ancestral homeland, the place where, by their own memory, the entire people emerged. And this is where things get strange. For a long time, scholars treated such accounts with condescension. A beautiful legend, they said. A myth. Peoples, they claimed, often invent grand origin stories. The real history, they insisted, would be told by excavations and science, not by fireside tales. And then excavations and science began to speak. And they said exactly what Choctaw elders had been repeating for centuries. Let's work through this carefully. Nanih Waiya is not a natural hill. It is a mound. It was built by human hands. Thousands of people, basket by basket, generation by generation, raised the earth into an enormous man-made mountain. And it is not the only such mound in the southeast. There are hundreds of them. Entire cities with plazas, with earthworks as tall as multi-story buildings, with populations that by some estimates reach tens of thousands of people in a single place. Remember that number, tens of thousands, in one city, centuries before the first Europeans set foot on this shore. The culture that built all of this, scholars call Mississippian, named for the great river. And this was not a handful of nomads with spears, as old movies like to depict. This was a civilization of builders, with agriculture, with trade routes stretching across half a continent. With astronomy, some of their earthworks are precisely aligned with the movement of the sun, with governance, craft, and art. And now comes the central question of this whole story, the one that changes everything. What happened to these people? Because when Europeans arrived in earnest, not the first rare ships, but true colonization, they found a very different picture. Not cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Instead, separate peoples living more simply, in smaller groups. And Europeans drew a convenient conclusion. They decided the great mounds were built by someone else, some mysterious vanished people, anyone, just not the ancestors of the native peoples living nearby. Entire theories emerged. The mounds, they said, were raised by lost tribes, or seafarers from across the ocean, or some ancient lost race that was later wiped out by savages. These ideas were published in books. They were taught. Educated people believed them. Now stop and think about why such a theory was even needed. It was needed for comfort. Because if great cities were built by some unknown people, long vanished, then the land seems to belong to no one. But if they were built by the direct ancestors of people still living here right now, then taking that land from them becomes a little harder, at least inside one's own head. The mystery builders theory was not a mistake. It was a very convenient mistake. And it held for a long time, too long, until two things came along that cannot be persuaded to stay silent. The archaeologists' shovel and genetic analysis. Archaeologists dug mound after mound and found no trace of a mysterious vanished race. They found continuity, the same building techniques, the same pottery, slowly changing from layer to layer, century to century, without any break. No one arrived and no one disappeared. People simply lived here. For a long time, a very long time, and then came the ability to look even deeper, into the bone itself, into DNA. And here I must be honest with you, because this matters more than any dramatic twist. DNA research involving native peoples is complicated. Many tribes, including the Choctaw, approach such research with great wariness, and they have strong reasons for this, which I'll explain later, reasons why this subject has become nearly forbidden. So what scientists were able to learn, they learned slowly, cautiously, and not always with permission. Keep that in mind. We'll return to it, and it will be one of the sharpest moments in this whole story. But the overall picture that genetics has provided about native peoples of the Americas in general turned out to be unexpectedly clear. The ancestors of all native peoples of both continents, the Choctaw, their neighbors, and peoples thousands of kilometers to the north and south, came to this continent from one direction. From the northwest, through land that no longer exists. During the depths of the Ice Age, sea levels were lower, and where water now separates Asia and Alaska, there was land. A wide, cold plain. Scientists call it Beringia. People came across that plain. More than 15,000 years ago. Perhaps much earlier, the dates keep getting pushed back as new discoveries are made, and from those first people descend all the native peoples of the Americas. 15,000 years. Sit with that number. For comparison, the Egyptian pyramids are more than 3 times younger. People were on this land, hunting, building, burying their dead, at a time when no pyramids existed anywhere on Earth. And through all that time, the line never broke. That is what the shovel, the bone, the pottery, and the elders at Nanih Waiya all say. From the first people who crossed Beringia, to the builders of the great mounds, to the Choctaw people standing on their land today. One unbroken thread, bent by catastrophe but never severed. So why does the textbook still compress all of this into a single paragraph? That is where the real investigation begins. Because from here on, the story isn't only about where the Choctaw came from. It's about who worked very hard to make sure you didn't know, and about what happened when not just history got involved, but big money, lawyers, and disputes over who is even permitted to decide who you are. And that, believe me, is far more charged than any legend about transatlantic sailors. But let's take it in order. Let's return to that mound, to Nanih Waiya. I said earlier that for the Choctaw this is their ancestral homeland, the place from which the people emerged. But I haven't told you the story itself. Without it, you won't understand what was taken from these people, or why it is far more painful than a mere dispute over dates and excavations. The Choctaw have 2 versions of the story of their beginning. Both lead to this mound. In one, the people emerged from the mound itself, directly from the earth. People rose up into the light from the depths of the mother mound, dried on its slopes in the sun, and spread across the land. Hence the name, Mother Mound. It gave birth to them in the literal sense, as a mother gives birth to a child. In the other version, there was a long journey. The people walked from somewhere in the west, many generations, carrying a sacred pole at the front. Each evening, the pole was planted in the ground. In the morning, they watched which way it leaned and walked in that direction, day after day, year after year, until one morning the pole stood straight, upright, in no direction, and that was the sign. They had arrived, home was here, and that is where Nanih Waiya was built. Now listen to what matters here. Both stories are about rootedness, about the fact that this land is not accidental. It is a destination. It was earned. It is home, one that was journeyed to or born from. There is not a drop of, "we are here temporarily" in these accounts. On the contrary, everything in them says, "we are from here. We have always been from here." Now recall what story the arriving Europeans told about that very same mound. That someone else built it. Someone mysterious, vanished, unknown. Anyone, just not the native peoples living nearby. Do you feel what happened here? These are not 2 different opinions about an old earthwork. These are 2 incompatible things. One side says, "This is our mother, we came from her." The other says, "No, you have nothing to do with this, a ghost built it." And the second version wins not because it is truer, but because it has power behind it. Textbooks, universities, the state, that is how erasure works. It doesn't always look like a bonfire of books. More often it looks like one short paragraph instead of an entire chapter. But let's be honest and demanding with ourselves. Because this is exactly the moment where it's easy to slide into righteous grievance and stop checking. That's not why we're here. So let's ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. Maybe Europeans simply made an honest mistake, with no malicious intent. Maybe they genuinely saw something different with their own eyes, not great cities, but scattered, smaller peoples, and honestly couldn't believe these were the same people. And in part, yes, they really did see something different. And here begins the darkest part of the whole story. Because between the great cities of the mound-building era and the peoples the Europeans encountered, something did happen. Something enormous. Something terrible. And about this, the textbook is again silent. It was disease. When the first Europeans passed through the southeast, these were still Spanish expeditions, long before any mass settlement. They brought with them something the local people had never encountered. Smallpox, measles, other diseases against which the native peoples had no immunity whatsoever. Their bodies were meeting these illnesses for the first time in thousands of years. And then something happened that is hard to fit inside the mind. By historians' estimates, in some areas it wasn't 10 people out of 100 who died. Not 30, but in some places up to 9 out of every 10. 9 out of 10. Entire cities, those same cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, emptied within 1 or 2 generations. The plazas grew over, the mounds still stood, but those who had built them were taken into the ground almost all at once. And here is what is crucial to understand about that number. Disease often traveled ahead of the Europeans themselves. It spread from people to people, along trade routes faster than any expedition moved. So by the time a European came to settle in earnest, he often saw not a living civilization, but its ashes. A land after catastrophe. A few survivors gathered into smaller groups because from the formerly large peoples, only a handful remained. Do you understand what this means? A European looked at the ruins and said, "These simple tribes could not have built such cities." But he was not looking at the builders, he was looking at the grandchildren of the builders, at those who had survived the end of the world. He mistook the aftermath of catastrophe for evidence that these people had no great ancestors. It's like arriving at the ruins of a great city a year after a terrible epidemic, seeing a few survivors in tents among the rubble, and declaring that these people are too simple to have built the stone buildings around them, that someone else must have built them, someone long vanished. That is what really happened to the memory of the Choctaw and their neighbors. First, disease decimated the civilization itself. Then those who arrived declared that civilization to be someone else's. And notice how one thing conveniently supported the other. The land was depopulated, so it seemed plentiful and seemingly free. And the builders of the great mounds were declared a mysterious ghost, so the survivors seemed to have no deep claim to it. 2 convenient stories that together freed people's hands. Now you understand why I said at the start that the issue wasn't ignorance, it was silence. But let's return to the science. Because accusations are easy, evidence is hard, and the whole power of this story is that it no longer needs to be taken on faith. It can now be read. In the earth and in the bone. Archaeologists digging the mounds of the southeast were looking for exactly that break. That boundary where the supposed mysterious builder people disappear and someone else, simpler, takes their place. And they didn't find it. The layers run one after another without a break. Ways of burying the dead, patterns on pottery, building techniques, all change slowly and gradually the way a person's handwriting changes over a long life. The same handwriting, the same hand. No foreign hand coming to replace it. There is only one break in this picture, and it's not where they were looking. It falls precisely at the arrival of Europeans and the wave of disease. That is where the populous life of the great cities ends. Not because the people were replaced, but because the people nearly died out, and the survivors rebuilt their lives from scratch, with fewer hands, on the bones of the former world. The bones said the same thing as the pottery, no phantom builder people. There is a direct line, interrupted by catastrophe, but not severed, bent almost to the ground, and yet not broken. Now I should warn you, because right here, where DNA could have put the final point and reconciled everyone, the story takes a sharp and unexpected turn. It turns out that for the Choctaw and other native peoples, this same DNA is not the long-awaited hero who will restore justice. It's more like an uninvited guest they don't quite trust. And their reasons are such that once you learn them, you may look at the entire genetic testing industry with very different eyes. Because the question, what does DNA tell us about a people's origins? That's one thing. But the question, who is permitted to take that DNA, store it, and decide what it means, that's something else entirely. And it's on that second question where big money, courts, and very unpleasant stories begin. So DNA, the hero who was supposed to set everything straight. Bone doesn't lie, Bone doesn't write convenient textbooks. Take a sample, read it, and there's your truth. That's what I thought when I started digging into this topic. And then I ran into something I didn't expect at all. It turned out that many Choctaw and other native peoples are not at all happy with this hero. More than that, they don't trust him. Not because they fear the truth about their origins, but because they've already seen how that truth gets turned against them. To help you understand, I need to tell you a story. It's not directly about the Choctaw, but it explains everything. In the West, in the state of Washington, there is a place by a river. In 1996, very old bones were found there. The skeleton of a man who turned out to be about 9,000 years old, one of the oldest people ever found on that continent. Scientists were electrified. Such a find was invaluable. It had to be studied. And the local native peoples said, "This is our ancestor. Return him to the earth. Let him be buried properly." And a dispute began that dragged on for years. Through the courts, scientists said, "Prove he is your ancestor. 9,000 years is an enormous span of time." The tribes answered, "Our stories say we have always been here. That is enough." Do you know how it ended? Years later, newer and more precise DNA showed the ancient man by the river was indeed most closely related to those very same local peoples. The bone ultimately confirmed what the elders had been saying from the start, and he was finally returned to the earth. But the Choctaw and other peoples took away from that story not "hooray, science is on our side." They took away something else, that their word alone doesn't count as evidence, that they had to spend years fighting through the courts just to bury their own ancestor, and that all that time scientists were handling the body of their forefather without asking them. Now you understand why the test tube is met with suspicion. But that's still not all. There is a second reason, and it strikes at the very heart of the matter. For the state, native peoples have always been a problem in one practical sense, in the sense of who even counts as one of them. Land depended on it. Treaties. Later, payments, rights, the very existence of the tribe as a people to be reckoned with. And time and again, outsiders tried to settle this question for the native peoples themselves. By blood, by percentage, by fraction. You've surely heard that ugly phrase, measuring a person in blood quantum. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. This was the attempt to measure whether a person had enough native blood to count as native. This was not invented by the peoples themselves. It was imposed from the outside, and behind it was cold calculation. The stricter the ruler, the fewer people meet the standard. And so the fewer people the state has obligations to, and the more land and money remains with the state. Think about that. Your very right to be yourself was turned into a fraction, into a number that could be whittled down. And now onto all of this comes the modern DNA test, the one from the ads, where you spit in a tube and find out who you are. Do you understand why for the Choctaw this is a painful subject? Because for them, this is not a charming hobby about ancestors. It is a continuation of that same ruler. Yet another outside instrument claiming the authority to measure their authenticity and deliver a verdict. Are you real or not? And now I will say what I set out to say with this whole conversation. And this may be the most important thing in the entire piece. A DNA test cannot determine which people you belong to. It cannot. At all. Remember this, even if you forget everything else. What such a test shows is statistics. It compares your genes with databases of present-day people from various places and says, this resembles these groups, in roughly these proportions. And that's it. It cannot see your family. It cannot see the language your grandmother spoke. It cannot see the community you grew up in, whose story you carry, who called you their own. And a people, the Choctaw or any other, is exactly that. It is belonging given by a community, kinship, language, memory, shared land. It is not a substance in the blood. It is a bond between people. That is why the Choctaw Nation itself says plainly, our citizens are not defined by a percentage on a test. They are defined by descent from our people and by belonging to our community. The test tube has no authority here. And here is the one honest, practical thought I promised. Free of charge, take it and use it. If you want to learn your true origins, start not with a test tube, but with living people and with paper. Sit with the elders in your family while they are alive and record everything. Names, places, who came from where, who married whom, what stories were passed down. This is the most valuable source there is, and it disappears with every elder who leaves. Then go to archives, old censuses, church and community records, land documents. That is where the real connections between generations are found. Not, you are 30% such and such, but living names and living lines you can actually trace. This works, it's honest, and it costs nothing but time. But let's return to our story, because we've arrived at the sharpest point. We established where the ancestors of the Choctaw came from, across the vanished land to the northwest, more than 15,000 years ago. We established that the great Mound cities were built by their direct ancestors, not by some invented phantom people. We established that the civilization was brought low not by another race, but by disease, and how that was later exploited. And we established why DNA itself, for these people, is not a long-awaited judge, but an old offender in a new coat. 2 questions remain. But what questions? First, if science ultimately confirms what the Choctaw already knew about themselves, then who has all this time been interested in a different version? Who stood to gain from the great mounds being considered the work of ghosts? Second, and sharper still, what exactly did ancient DNA reveal about the depth of this lineage? And why do some of those findings go unannounced by both scientists and the peoples themselves, but for completely opposite reasons? That is where we continue. Who stood to benefit? Let's finally call things by their names. I promised this question earlier. Who was interested in having the great mounds attributed to a phantom people, rather than to the direct ancestors of living native peoples? The answer is uncomfortable, but simple. Those who wanted the land. Look at how it works. Imagine you come to someone else's land and want to stay forever. Not as a guest, as the owner. What stands in your way? A thought, your own thought, inside your own head, that the land already belongs to someone. That a people lived here before you, deeply rooted, with their own cities, temples, and ancestors' graves. It's hard to sleep peacefully with that thought. Now remove that thought. Tell yourself, the great structures here were built by someone long vanished, mysterious, unknown. And these people living nearby, they are simple, they seem to be here by accident, they have no deep roots. And that's it. Your conscience is clear, the land seems unclaimed. Take it. That is what the Phantom Builder's story was for. Not out of curiosity, it did a job. A heavy, dirty job, turning seizure into something normal. First in people's heads, and then on paper, in the laws and treaties that those same people wrote. And notice, I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Simply look at the timeline. The theories about the mysterious vanished builder people flourished most vigorously at exactly the time when the displacement of native peoples from their lands in the southeast was most active. When the Choctaw and their neighbors were being driven from their homelands and marched thousands of miles west along the trail that would later be called the Trail of Tears. Convenient science and convenient politics walked hand in hand. Each justified the other. There is your answer to the first question. The phantom people were needed not by history, they were needed by those who were taking the land. But I promised you the second question, and it is far more subtle. What did ancient DNA reveal about the depth of this lineage? And why do some findings go quietly unremarked, but for different reasons on different sides? One must be very careful here, and I am weighing every word. Scientists have learned to extract genetic material not only from fresh bones, but from very ancient ones. from remains thousands of years old. And when such ancient samples from that continent can be read, the picture that emerges is remarkably coherent. The ancient people turn out to be relatives of the present-day native peoples living in the same regions. Not newcomers, not ghosts, their own. That very unbroken line I've been insisting on since the beginning is confirmed now at the level of the genes themselves, not just pottery and stories. One would think, here it is, the final victory. Science has come down on the side of truth. Celebrate. But not everyone is celebrating, and here begins the most humanly complicated part. Among some scholars, there is a quiet discomfort. Ancient DNA sometimes shows that the picture was not perfectly simple, that over thousands of years, different groups moved across the continent, things mixed, some early lineages faded out, others diverged. Living history is always more complex than a slogan, and some researchers are cautious not because they're hiding the truth, but because they fear that any nuanced detail will be pulled out of context and turned into a weapon, that someone will seize on the phrase, "it wasn't entirely straightforward," and use it to revive the old vicious refrain, "so they weren't really from here after all." And from the peoples themselves, the discomfort is the opposite. Even a well-meaning, confirming finding was obtained by methods they find objectionable, often from the bones of their ancestors, often without their consent. And they rightly ask, why, in order for our own truth to count as truth, did someone have to disturb our dead and run them through a machine? Why wasn't our word enough, again? Do you see the drama? The same finding, the same bone. And everyone is uncomfortable at once, but for mirror-opposite reasons. The scientist fears that complexity will be used against the people. The people are angry that proving the obvious required disturbing an ancestor. And in the middle, a truth that both sides essentially already accept. The lineage is ancient, deep, local, unbroken. That is why I said at the start that DNA is neither hero nor villain here. It is simply a very sharp instrument, and any sharp instrument depends on the hand that holds it. In good hands, it returns a 9,000-year-old ancestor home. In bad hands, it becomes a new kind of ruler for measuring people in fractions and deciding who is real. And here I want you to do one thing, right now, without delay. Think of your own elders, parents, grandparents, if they are still alive, those who remember names and stories that exist in no archive. Because the lesson of the Choctaw is not only about the Choctaw, it is about all of us. True origin doesn't live in a test tube, it lives in the memory of living people and in the papers those people leave behind. Both disappear quietly. An elder passes and takes with them a dozen stories no one else will ever tell. A box of old documents gets wet in a garage, and an entire line that could have been traced back 200 years is severed. Don't let it disappear. Sit with your elders, write things down, sort through the papers. That is your true DNA, the kind made of memory and names, not statistics. We are nearly at the end. One last section remains. In it, I want to bring everything together and say what this whole topic was really worth raising, about whose face actually looks back at us from this land. It is not the face drawn in the old textbooks. Let's bring it all together. Walk the whole path once more, but now quickly, in a single breath, so you can feel the full line of it. More than 15,000 years ago, people crossed land that no longer exists. A cold plain where today water separates Asia from Alaska. They came and they stayed. From them descended all the native peoples of that continent, including the ancestors of the Choctaw. Thousands of years passed. These people did not stand still. They learned to grow food, to read the movement of the sun, to build. By hand they raised the great mounds, whole cities with plazas and temples, with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Nanih Waiya, the mother mound, is one of them. For the Choctaw, it is literally the birthplace of the people. Then came Catastrophe. Not another race, not conquerors with swords first, but disease. Smallpox and measles wiped out in some places 9 out of every 10 people. Great cities emptied within a generation or two. Survivors gathered into smaller peoples on the bones of the former world. And then came those who wanted that emptied land, who invented a convenient story, that the great things here had been built by someone mysterious and long vanished, and that the native peoples living nearby had nothing to do with it. That story was not for the sake of history, it was for taking land with a clean conscience. And under that story, the Choctaw were driven from their homeland and marched westward along the Trail of Tears. And then Bone, Pottery, and Jean began to speak, and all three said the same thing, the very thing Choctaw elders had been repeating by their mound for centuries: no phantom people, one continuous line. From the first arrivals, to the mound builders, to the living Choctaw today. Bent by catastrophe, but not broken. That is the whole story. But I promised you one final thought. It's the reason all of this was worth doing. Look once more at what we examined. Every time someone from the outside tried to define the Choctaw, they were wrong. Or they lied. The textbook that squeezed a people into a single paragraph was wrong. The theory about phantom builders was a lie. The ruler measuring a person in blood fractions degraded. The test tube promising to reduce a people to a percentage is simply incapable of it. And every time the Choctaw spoke about themselves, they were right. Right about the mother mound. Right about their antiquity. Right that they are from here and have always been from here. Science did not reveal their history to them. Science, centuries later, finally caught up with them. There is the main lesson. A people knows best who they are. Origin is not the verdict of someone else's machine. It is the memory a people carries themselves. And now, that face. I promise to say whose face actually looks back at us from this land. Old textbooks trained us to see one image. The native person as a guest in their own history. Someone at the edge of a great story about other people. They appeared, faded, left along the Trail of Tears, made way. A face at the edge of the frame. The truth is the opposite. The face of the Choctaw is not at the edge of the frame. It is the oldest face on this entire land. It has looked out from it longer than the pyramids have stood. It built cities when in other parts of the world the first stones of future capitals had not yet been laid. It survived the end of the world in the form of an epidemic and did not disappear. People tried to erase it into a single paragraph and failed. It is still here, alive, speaking, remembering. The Choctaw were exactly who they always said they were. The mystery was not in them. The mystery was the lie told about them. And that is what we have finally solved. 3 things in closing. Listen carefully. They matter. First, a question for you personally, and I want you to answer it in the comments. In this whole story, one moment hits harder than the others for each person. Write in the comments a number from 1 to 5. Which of these 5 moments struck you most? 1. The mother mound Nanih Waiya and the story of the people emerging from the earth. 2. The epidemic that wiped out 9 out of 10 and the emptied great cities. 3. The convenient lie about phantom builders invented for the sake of land. 4. The ancient ancestor at the river whose return to the earth was fought for in court 9,000 years later. 5. The blood quantum ruler and the test tube still trying today to measure people in percentages. Just a number, 1 through 5. I genuinely want to see what caught you. Based on those answers, I'll know what to dig into next. Second, forward this video to one person. Not to everyone, to one. Each of us knows someone like that, a person who is right now about to spit into a tube to find out who they really are. Who expects a test to hand them their roots, their people, their true self. Send this video to that person before they take a number on a report as their identity. One share from you might spare them the mistake of looking for themselves in the wrong place and push them to call their grandmother while she can still tell them who they really are. That is worth more than any test. Third, what comes next? We examined how a convenient story helped take land from a people. But that was not the coldest page. Next week I'll show you a document. A real one, official, stamped. An instruction by which people were deprived not of land, but of children. How entire generations of native children were taken from their families and sent to special schools to have their language, their names, their memory. Everything that makes a people, stripped from them. And I'll show a paper from that era that makes plain. Those who arranged this understood exactly what they were doing. It was not a mistake. It was a plan. If you don't want to miss it, you know what to click. For now, sit with your elders. Record their stories, while they can still be heard.